From the PEP Radio Newsroom, this is the Hourly News Blast. This is part two of the story we are sharing from The Advocate about a proposed HUD change that would allow discrimination based on sexual orientation within housing. Why senators say LGBTQ plus people are at risk. Well, the practical effect, the senators warn, would be to make access to housing and shelter more precarious for people already at disproportionate risk of losing both. As the Advocate previously reported, the rule would force federally funded shelters and housing programs to decide placement based on sex assigned at birth rather than gender identity. If finalized, it would affect emergency shelters, domestic violence shelters, homeless housing programs, and other federally funded facilities with shared sleeping quarters or bathrooms. That could mean a transgender woman fleeing abuse is turned away from a women's shelter. It could also mean a cisgender woman who does not conform to traditional expectations of femininity is asked to prove she belongs there. This proposed rule would deny safe and equal access to housing and shelter for anyone who a grantee chooses to question, and will disproportionately affect gay, transgender, and intersex Americans, the senators write. The rule would allow grant recipients, subrecipients, owners, operators, managers, and providers of single-sex or sex-specific facilities to require assurances and evidence to confirm the sex of someone seeking service. The senators say that would invite invasive questioning, document demands, and subjective judgments by shelter workers or social service providers. The Advocate previously reported that HUD does not clearly define what counts as proof, raising concerns that shelters could demand identification documents or medical records, or rely on staff discretion to determine who looks feminine enough to enter. For people arriving at a domestic violence shelter in crisis, those decisions can determine whether they get a bed or are sent back into danger. A shelter provider should not be directed by the federal government to implement policies that would force them to filter residents based on a social worker's perception of their gender, the senators write. HUD has framed the proposal as a way to protect women's shelters and align agency policy with Trump's executive order. In a press release announcing the rule change, Turner said HUD was moving to, quote, bring biological truth and sanity back, end quote, to department policies. The senators outright reject that premise. While the administration claims this is an effort to defend women's rights, the reality is that it will target the entire LGBTQ plus community, lead women to be harassed and investigated regarding their sex, and deny Americans access to their fair housing rights under the law, the letter says. The legal fight behind the rule is complex. The senators also cite the Supreme Court's 2020 ruling in Bostock v. Clayton County, which held that discrimination because of sex under Title VII includes discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. HUD under President Joe Biden later concluded that the Fair Housing Act's sex discrimination protections likewise prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Trump administration has moved to reverse that understanding. The senators say HUD leadership has already undermined Fair Housing, Civil Rights, and Violence Against Women Act enforcement, including by telling fair housing complainants last year that housing decisions based on sexual orientation were, quote, not subject to federal fair housing laws, end quote. The proposed rule would also attempt to preempt conflicting state and local laws, according to the letter, and could use penalties, according to HUD, including those of loss of federal funding, to force compliance. The senators say HUD itself acknowledges that the rule could result in people being denied access to their preferred single-sex shelters or their preferred accommodations in other shelters and being required to find other shelter options. The senators warned that those options may not exist, citing National Alliance to End Homelessness data showing that 61% of states and territories already have too few shelter beds to meet demand. The Fair Housing Act does not mandate HUD to choose between protecting one protected group over another, nor are women and LGBTQ plus individuals mutually exclusive or conflicting groups, the senators write. HUD is required by law to provide fair and equal housing protections to all Americans. HUD, conveniently, did not respond to the advocate's request for comment. And this concludes the story for now. We will share with ways you can take action on the Pennsylvania Equality Project website. The PEP Radio YouTube channel has news updates all day, every day. PEP Radio is available on the Live 365 app, the PEP Radio page at paequality.com, Roku, Alexa, and wherever you find streaming radio. Up next, we have the Meadville area weather forecast here on PEP Radio.